there, and welcome to another episode of Triple D with myself and Pastor Steve here at Living Hope Presbyterian Church in Greer, South Carolina. So we're going to continue on with our discussion of God's sovereignty, especially as it pertains to the coronavirus crisis, and as general theological treatises and discussions. There's never a wrong time to discuss God's sovereignty. This is a truth that we know from the Scriptures, and that sticks with us throughout a lifetime. This is a pivotal doctrine of Christian theology. So with that, Steve, I think we should introduce our guest. We'll go back to the Westminster Confession of Faith. We're looking primarily at chapter 5, section 1 is the primary area where we're looking at, so I'll read that for us. God, the great creator of all things, doth uphold, direct, dispose, and govern all creatures' actions and things, from the greatest even to the least, by his most wise and holy providence, according to his infallible foreknowledge, and the free and immutable counsel of his own will, to the praise of the glory of his wisdom, power, justice, goodness, and mercy. And Steve, today I wanted to look at this phrase, by his most wise and holy providence. So we're going to discuss a couple of things. We're going to look at some verses as well, and we're going to discuss what exactly does that mean, how God acts by his most wise and holy providence. Now, two things that we want y'all to think about, as well as Pastor Steve and I have been discussing and thinking about, is God's omnipresence and his omniscience. So those are two big theological words that mean that God knows all things, and he is everywhere. There's nothing that God does not see. There is nothing that God doesn't know. He always knows the best way to accomplish anything. And whatever he's trying to accomplish with the current crisis, with all the crises that have hit the world in the past and those that will come in the future, God knows the best way possible to get through those because he is the one who has ordained them to come to pass. So Steve, with that, if you want to look at one of our proof texts here, is Proverbs chapter 15, verse 3. So Steve, if you would read that for us and discuss a little bit.
And before I read this, we want to just testify right up front that we believe this corona crisis, this virus, did not catch God by surprise. It's part of God's plan, and God only does what is good for us and for his glory. So we'll read Proverbs 15:3. The eyes of the Lord are in every place, watching the evil and the good, which means nothing is catching God by surprise. The Lord is seeing what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, our sins, our witnesses for him. And many have said that this virus may be a judgment from God, and that may be true. I don't know that, but what I do know is that the eyes of the Lord are everywhere and sees everything that all the people are doing.
Yes, yes. Whether good or evil, God knows all things, and he has ordained all things to come to pass. Now, God, of course, is not the author of sin. We do not worship an evil God. There is no sin with God. The Scripture makes that abundantly clear. But nothing happens that is outside of his sovereign control, of course. All things happen according to God's infallible foreknowledge. They occur under his watchful eye. He sees all things. Steve, I can remember too when I was about 7 years old when 9/11 happened. And there was a lot of folks asking, where was God during the 9/11 crisis? And God was right there in the middle of it. God was the one who knew that this was going to happen. It did not take him by surprise. He allowed for it to happen. It was ordained by God. Why he did that, no one knows. One of my favorite quotes is from the Chronicles of Narnia, where they're discussing Aslan the lion. He is not a tame lion, but he is a good lion. And the same can be said of God as well. God is not a tame lion. He's not something that we can put in a box and then pop him out when we want him to, and then push him back down when it's convenient for us. No, he is sovereign. He knows all things, and he knows what's best for us.
Well, speaking of 9/11, one of my verses that I like to use is Amos writes, can a catastrophe hit a city and God not be in it?
Absolutely.
That's the verse that I use for 9/11 because what we would say is as a disaster hit New York City. And now I would apply the same verse to the coronavirus. Can this happen and God not be in it? And as we read from the confession, the answer is no. God's right in the middle of it.
Absolutely. God knows all things. He is in the middle of all things.
Now, there are a lot of churches that do not hold to this teaching.
No.
And there are many churches that would hold to it, but they would say, well, we don't talk about it or we don't preach it. We teach this doctrine, believe strongly in it, and find great comfort in it.
Yes, absolutely. For those who love God and are called according to his purposes, there is great comfort in this truth, is it not, Steve? That God sees all things. For the believer, that God sees all things is a great comfort. It is a great help in trials and in all situations to know that God sees what I'm doing and He is taking part in it as well. It's terrifying for the non-believer to know that God, the sovereign ruler of the cosmos, is constantly watching and sees all things. That's why mankind in its natural state hates God.
And the unbeliever does not want to believe this doctrine.
The unbeliever does not want to believe this doctrine. It's unfathomable to his mind. But to us, though, who are believers, we believe that this is a great comfort to us, that God sees all things, from the greatest even to the least, and by His most wise and holy providence. We know that God knows all things. We take great comfort in that. And Steve, one other verse that I wanted to look at as well is going to be in Exodus chapter 2. So if you want to flip over there really quickly as well with us. Exodus chapter 2, and setting the context with this one as well, I've been going through Exodus in my personal devotional time, actually. So the book of Exodus is all about the people of God and the exodus from Egypt. Moses leads the people out of Egypt. They go to Mount Sinai, where they are given the Mosaic covenant. They are given the law of God, which shows the way that God operates. It shows His moral attributes. It shows what is good and pleasing in His sight, and that we are called to do those things as Christians as well. We are called to obey the Ten Commandments. No one can perfectly, and we are condemned by that law, but we are still called to follow it nonetheless. But I was reading, though, in verses 24 and 25. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered His covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice of them. So see, nothing is going on here that God doesn't see, of course. The people of Israel were in slavery. They were in bondage to an oppressive foreign power, and they were crying out and asking, is God seeing what is happening? Does He care? Does He not see His people in these afflictions, and is He just merely casting us by the wayside? And the answer, of course, is no. God sees that, and He cares. He remembers His covenant that He made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob for the sake of His people. This is the Old Testament church, of course. You and I are part of the New Testament church. We are the same. We are descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob by the Spirit. Therefore, God cares about us, and He remembers His covenant with our people. That is why the church shall not pass away from this earth until all things are accomplished, is because God has made a covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob, and through Christ in the new covenant, and He will not abandon those covenant promises. So during this crisis as well, Steve, by way of application, I thought, is that even though we notice that a lot of things are closing, that a lot of people are out of jobs or out of work, God still remembers His people. He hears their groaning cries. He remembers the covenant that He has made with our forefathers in the faith, and He will not allow us to fall by the wayside. And Steve, also being a Semitic guy, I like my Hebrew, of course. And I will also say in this last phrase in verse 25, where it says God took notice of them, that Hebrew word for notice can also mean to know. This also means that God knows them. He knows them inside, He knows them outside, just like He knows you and I, Steve. Just like He knows all of our listeners and viewers, whether they are born again or not born again. He knows them from the inside to the outside. He knows how many hairs are on your head. He knows if a sparrow falls to the ground. He knows all things. And He knows the best way to accomplish these things as well. You see that all throughout wisdom literature, throughout Job, which Steve has been preaching through as well. Job often questions God throughout all those things. He doesn't know if the way that these things are happening are what's best. But God knows all things, and He always does what's best. Perhaps not for all mankind at that given time, because He will judge those who reject Him. But He does what's best for His name's sake. And Westminster, of course, always sums that up. This is to the praise of His own glory. Steve, anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I was just going to add that in my Bible, I've underlined the word covenant. Because if you want to pray and appeal to God, you cannot go wrong appealing to the Father through the covenant.
Yes.
Because the covenant is the document that He has used to determine how He will work with us, His people. And I thought He saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice of them. He knows them. And I thought, that's how we need to appeal and pray to the Lord today. We can say, Lord, even if this is a judgment from You, we are praying and asking You to know or take notice of Your people and answer the prayer and show mercy to us as a nation because of Your people that You love and You know so dearly.
Absolutely. So we have that right, too, to appeal to the Father through the Son, Jesus Christ, because we are His people. We have that right to appeal to His covenant, to His promises. And that is also what Moses does later on when God threatens to destroy the Israelites. They appeal to the covenant made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God says, no, you promised beforehand that you would give Abraham a people unto himself. And God says, that is right, I do. And He knows that. He remembers those covenants that He made, and He will honor them. Even if we break them at times, even though we sin, even though we fail, even though we fall short of the glory of God and sin against Him, God still remembers the promises that He gave.
So if you've lost your job today, if you've had a family member that's in the hospital because of the virus, pray as a Christian and appeal to the Lord through His covenant to show mercy to His people.
Absolutely. And God sees all things. He is there with us. Jesus Christ Himself went before us and has suffered even worse than any of us who are alive have suffered. He bore the pain that was reserved for us, bore the wrath of God upon the cross at Calvary, and we can have grace and faith and salvation through Him should we believe in Him as well. And Steve, with that, I think that's a good stopping point for today. And we will continue on next week with our discussion on God's sovereignty as it pertains to His providence in the Westminster Confession of Faith in the Scriptures. We ask that you would tune in with us next week. May God bless you richly and abundantly. Thank you.